Okay, let's take a look at exercise 24 on the endocrine system. We'll take a quick flyby on what all is in the lab book, and in a lecture you'll get a whole lot more of this. So exercise 24 in your lab book is about the endocrine system. When you talk about the endocrine system, you're talking about hormones. Now, don't make hormones any more complicated than what they are. These are chemical signals floating around in your blood and body. By definition, a chemical does have to enter the blood to be a hormone, and of course they're distributed all throughout the body. You'll see very other similar terms. There's many different types of chemical signals in the body, hormones just being one. Ligands is another. You saw these a lot on ion channels back in chapter 3 in the cell when you looked at the cell membrane. Drugs often act as chemical signals in the body doing something. So all these have some familiarities, similarities there. Now we'll also look at different types of glands. Back in chapter, I believe it was 4 on tissues, they talked about endocrine versus exocrine glands. Now we're not looking at exocrine glands for this chapter here. Exocrine glands have a duct, so they will secrete something onto the surface of something, skin, inner wall of the stomach, whatever that may be. We're not concerned with those. We're concerned with endocrine glands, endo from within, crino to separate in Latin. These chemicals are released by cells. We'll look at the hormones, where they come from here just a little bit further along. These don't have ducts. As they're released by cells, they'll be released into the interstitial spaces and eventually make their way into the blood. And again, by definition, a hormone must enter the blood and travel some distance to its target tissue, meaning where it works in the body. So next here we see this term, target areas or target tissues. Either way you like it, same thing. This is where a hormone works. So here's where you find the cells receptive to it. Some hormones are very specific and work in one place. Some might work on just about every cell type in the body. So we'll look at the effects also. What does the hormone do whenever it gets to its target tissue? Always remember there's 3 things you really want to know about all these hormones. Where is it made? Where does it work? And what does it do? That's why your book will always talk about production site, target tissue, effects. Where is it made? Where does it work? What's it do? So let's start here with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus was discussed quite a bit with the brain and the nervous system, but it's also a very big, important part also of the endocrine system. Now, it is a very big, major controller of the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland puts out more hormones than any other gland in the body. So this hypothalamus does a lot of things, but in the lecture you're going to see it releases a lot of chemical signals that either have releasing or inhibiting in their name. And those releasing and inhibiting chemical signals are going to travel to the anterior part of the pituitary and regulate the release of hormones from there. So you'll see again a lot more of that in the lecture. Let's look first also at the pineal gland here. Now this may be called the pineal gland or pineal body, and it releases a hormone you may have heard of before called melatonin. Think of melatonin as something that mellows an individual out. In other words, slows them down, makes them less active, and at the same time it inhibits reproductive cycles. Now they believe that this pineal gland is somehow tied to your eyes and it's monitoring something called photoperiod. Photoperiod is a fancy way of saying how many daylight hours are in a day, how long the days are. So think about this. We all know as you move towards the fall and the winter, the days get shorter. They think that the pineal gland can detect the shortening of the days. And when the days shorten, it releases more melatonin, slows animals down, mellows them out, and at the same time inhibits reproduction. So think about a bear hibernating, right? It's less active in the winter. Well, that's basically what this hormone's doing. At the same time, it inhibits reproductive cycles. You don't want animals having babies in the winter. They'd freeze to death and be nothing to eat, so they'd starve. And then if you think about as you move towards the spring and the summer and the days get longer, then less melatonin is released. Animals aren't mellowed out. They get more active, and without it there to inhibit reproduction, that's when most animals reproduce. So again, you'll see more of this in your lecture. Now let's come down to the pituitary gland right here. The pituitary gland has 2 very different, very distinct halves. Even though they are side by side, they've got nothing to do with each other. Each side produces its own hormones, does its own thing, does not cooperate with the other side in any way. Now the first half we want to look at is called the anterior pituitary. also called the adenohypophysis. I believe adeno means gland in Latin. Most glands are made of epithelial cells, and that's exactly what this anterior part is. Way back in embryonic development, long before a person is born, epithelial cells in the roof of their oral cavity moved up and formed this anterior part of the pituitary. Now look at these 9 major chemical signals, these hormones that come from that anterior pituitary. The first one right here being called lipotropins. I bet you can figure out by the first part of the name that's got something to do with lipids, and it does. Now what it targets specifically are adipocytes, the fat cells in the body, and it increases fat breakdown. In other words, releases stored energy. So let's say an individual's blood sugar levels have gotten low for whatever reason. They've been exercising all day, haven't had anything to eat. Your body can do a lot of things that affect blood sugar levels. This is just one of them. So if your blood sugar is low, release lipotropins. Tells your fat cells to release stored energy, and that'll raise your blood sugar up. Simple negative feedback right there. Number 2, beta endorphins. These right here target the brain, and these act as painkillers. So they're going to work on the sensory cortex of the cerebrum. You may remember that from the brain chapter earlier. So these are painkillers. So when you're in pain, beta endorphins are released, and there's their effect to stop it. Number 3, melanocyte stimulating hormone. Increases the production of melanin in the skin. So look at the name. Melanocyte stimulating hormone stimulates melanocytes in your skin. Melanocytes do one big thing, make melanin. Remember, melanin is what gives that pigment to the epidermis and other parts of your body like the iris of your eye and so on. And of course in your skin it's good ultraviolet light protection. Number 4, thyroid stimulating hormone. Here's another one just like number 3 that largely tells you what it does. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to produce and release its hormones, T3 and T4. So we'll look at those two from the thyroid gland further along. Number 5, growth hormone, also called somatostatin. Here's one of those chemicals that targets almost everything in the body. Growth hormone causes growth. Stimulates mitosis in cells which can divide. And those that can't, like skeletal muscle and such. Still stimulates those cells to grow. Add more actin and myosin. Remember, it's those filaments that slide past each other. This is another chemical that can raise your blood sugar levels. If an individual is going to do a lot of growing, they're going to need plenty of glucose available to cells. A lot of hormones will affect your blood sugar levels. That's just one of them right there. Number 6, prolactin, also called luteotropin. This one right here targets the mammary glands and causes production of milk, not release, but prolactin causes production. Remember, the P goes with the P. Prolactin for production of milk. Number 7 here, follicle stimulating hormone. When you hear follicle stimulating hormone, think reproductive cells of the body. That's what gametes are right there. Talking about the sperm cells and the oocytes of the male or the female. So follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the production of the reproductive cells. And of course the reproductive cells are made in the ovaries and the testes. So that's specifically what it's targeting there. Luteinizing hormone has a couple of different effects. Now, you'll see more about these chemical signals here like number 7, 8 when you get to the reproductive system and such. But when you look at luteinizing hormone, one big thing it does in females is causes ovulation. Ovulation is the release of a reproductive cell called an oocyte from the ovaries. So it stimulates ovulation, the release of that cell from an ovary. This also stimulates testosterone production in males. So that's a very important hormone with them right there. Number 9, adrenal corticotropin hormone. Now when we get to the adrenal glands, you'll see there's 2 halves to it. One half's called the adrenal cortex. So adrenal corticotropin hormone targets the adrenal cortex, which is one part of the adrenal glands, and it will stimulate the release of other chemical signals. When we get to the adrenal glands, we'll see those. So there's your 9 big chemicals of the anterior, right? The front part of the pituitary gland. Now looking here next, we see the posterior pituitary. So notice how the pituitary gland has front and back halves, right? Anterior, posterior. We said that front half was made of epithelial cells. This rear half, notice how it's called the neurohypophysis. is just a bundle of axons coming down from the hypothalamus. So if you could reach up in the hypothalamus, grab a handful of axons, remember that's the output part of a neuron, drag them down, that's what your posterior pituitary is right there. Now where these 9 hormones from the anterior part are regular hormones, these 2 over here are neurohormones. That means hormones produced by neurons. So they have their own little specific name. Now this part right here also develops in embryonic development. It's where part of the hypothalamus just grows down, just that axon part. Now those axons will move and store these 2 neurohormones which are produced up in the hypothalamus. Sometimes books will ask you, where are these 2 hormones, ADH and oxytocin, produced? They're produced up in the hypothalamus. All those little organelles in those neuron cell bodies make them. But these chemicals are stored and released from the posterior pituitary. So that's a different place right there. So let's look at this first neurohormone here called Anti-Diuretic Hormone, often just called ADH, but it has another name called vasopressin. We'll see why. Now go back to this first name, Anti-Diuretic Hormone. Most people know that diuretics cause you to release water. Anti-diuretic will do the opposite. It has 2 different target tissues, one being the kidneys. It will tell the kidneys, hey, reabsorb and hold water. Now telling the kidneys to hold water will raise your blood pressure. That's what this hormone is all about. But it's also called vasopressin because it presses, it constricts blood vessels. Blood vessels have smooth muscle in the wall. This will tell that muscle to constrict. So let's say for any reason somebody's blood pressure is too low. There are many things the body can do to raise it. One thing it can do is release anti-diuretic hormone. Tells the kidneys to hold water. That'll help to raise your blood pressure. Tells blood vessels to constrict, which also raises your blood pressure right there. Think about diuretics that cause you to release water are often used to treat high blood pressure. You got to remember that water balance is first about blood pressure more than anything else. More water you got in you, higher your pressure will go. More water you lose, the lower your pressure will drop right there. So more of this will raise your blood pressure, less of it would drop it right there. Next we have oxytocin. This one has 2 different target tissues. Now where you almost entirely hear about oxytocin is causing labor contractions. It will target the smooth muscle in the wall of the uterus. We'll see that further in the reproductive system. So it targets that smooth muscle in the wall, tells it to contract, causes labor contractions. But it also targets the smooth muscle around mammary glands, causing milk release, milk expulsion, however you want to look at it right there. So a baby growing inside the uterus, causing that muscle to stretch, is one thing causes the release of oxytocin. But a nursing baby also causes the release of this chemical because milk release is another thing it does. That'll bring us to the thyroid gland. Now this is found just inferior to your larynx, right? Go right below your voice box. It's wrapped around your trachea and esophagus. You can't feel it, but it is there. Now it puts out several hormones. The first 2 we want to look at, that's usually just called thyroid hormones, are more precisely called T3 and T4. Now those stand for triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine. Each one of these numbers, the 3 and 4, actually tell you how much iodine is needed to make each one of them. 3 or 4 atoms of iodine needed to make each. This is why you really need iodine in your diet, because this is a very important hormone when it comes to metabolism. Think of that as how active your cells are and how much ATP they have available to them. So very important chemical, iodine and thyroid hormone, don't forget that. So you can see right here, thyroid hormone, they say, is responsible for regulating metabolism. Now what it does, it targets almost every cell type in the body. It's roughly 200 different cell types in the human body. Targets almost every type of cell and tells them to make more mitochondria, and then makes those mitochondria more active. Well, if you target cells and tell them to make more mitochondria and then make them more active, they're going to have way more ATP. When you're young, thyroid hormone levels are far higher because of all that growth that's going on. Cells need to be more active at that time versus when you're an adult. And it's this chemical right here that makes children have so much energy, not other things you've heard about there. Number 2 here, calcitonin. Bet you could figure out this one's got something to do with calcium right here. Now look at what it targets in the body. Don't just think of it as targeting bone. More specifically, know that it targets osteoclast. Remember, any cell with clast in the name is going to break something down. So these osteoclasts break down bone. But look at what calcitonin does. Decreases. In other words, makes them less active. If you're breaking down bone, you're releasing calcium. But think of this as like an off switch. So let's say a person has plenty of calcium in their blood. You've been eating it, you've been consuming plenty of milk, whatever your calcium source is. You wouldn't need osteoclasts to break down bone and release more. So when your blood calcium levels are adequate or high, release calcitonin. Where calcitonin turns off the osteoclast, stops the breakdown of bone, meaning it stops the release of calcium. So they'll tell you this works to lower your blood calcium levels. Not exactly correct. It just keeps from elevating them more than what you would need right there. So osteoclast activity, very big with that one. Now we move down to the parathyroid glands, producing parathyroid hormone. Now these are actually found on the surface of the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland looks about like a bow tie in its shape. And at the 4 corners of that bow tie is where you'll find parathyroid glands. Some people have 2 of them, some 3, some 4. Shouldn't be any problem no matter what the number. But parathyroid glands put out parathyroid hormone. Now this chemical will work to raise your blood calcium levels, right? So when your blood calcium levels are low, release the PTH. Now one thing this does is stimulate osteoclast. Osteoclasts get more active, you break down more bone, you release more calcium, and that'll work to raise your blood calcium levels up. It also tells the kidneys, reabsorb all the calcium you can, because if you're low on it, you don't want the kidneys to let any escape in the urine. Hold that calcium, helps to raise your blood calcium levels. Also stimulates calcium absorption in the small intestine. Small intestine is where you absorb practically everything you eat or drink. So you consume calcium, tells your small intestine to absorb it, again, works to raise your blood calcium levels. And then also increases the production of vitamin D. Vitamin D is a chemical needed for calcium absorption in the small intestine. So everything this chemical is doing is working to raise your blood calcium levels. Right after that, we have the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands, there are 2 of them, and they sit right on top of your kidneys. Look almost like little cats or caps right on top of them. Now there are 2 halves to the adrenal glands, kind of similar to what we saw with the pituitary. One half is called the adrenal medulla, and it is part of the sympathetic division of the nervous system. Remember how the sympathetic division loves to release epinephrine and norepinephrine? Same thing right here. Then there's another part called the adrenal cortex. Releases cortisol, aldosterone, and androgens, right? Should be a N right there, so let's correct that. So looking back at our 2 parts right here. The adrenal medulla, these are neurons, and specifically sympathetic division neurons. So again, remember those neurons love to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. You have probably talked about these before. Same thing right here. Remember, they're associated with the fight or flight division of the nervous system. Think about all the changes that happen in your body when you get physically active. This will cause your heart rate to increase. Also increase the force of the contractions. It's going to cause your breathing, your ventilation to increase. You're going to send way more blood to heart, lungs, and skeletal muscle. But don't forget at the same time when these chemicals dilate blood vessels to heart, lungs, and skeletal muscle, remember they're constricting blood vessels just about everywhere else. If you're going to send more blood to things like heart, lungs, and skeletal muscle, then you got to pull it from somewhere. So remember, it's dilating some blood vessels and it's constricting others right there. Then we've got our adrenal cortex. Cortisol is a chemical from here, one of them. There are many possible functions of cortisol, the primary one being acting as an anti-inflammatory. Blocks inflammatory chemicals that cause inflammation, pain, and swelling, and all those things right there. Also stimulates the production of something in the lungs called surfactant from these cells called type 2 pneumocytes. We'll see more of that when we get to the chapter on the lungs. There's also here aldosterone. Aldosterone targets your kidneys. Tells the kidneys to reabsorb sodium, and if they hold sodium, they're going to hold water. Remember, water follows solutes. So where the sodium goes, the water's going to follow it. So it's going to tell your kidneys to hold sodium in water. At the same time, aldosterone tells the kidneys to excrete, in other words, get rid, remove from the body hydrogen and potassium. So if you got too much hydrogen or potassium in you, aldosterone would tell the kidneys to get rid of that excess. And then androgens are associated with females in producing secondary sex characteristics of them. So not much is mentioned on those right there. Then we get down to the pancreas. It's just posterior to your stomach, right behind it in the body. It is a mixed gland, meaning it is endocrine and exocrine. Now the exocrine part is about the digestive system. You're going to see that most of your digestive enzymes come from the pancreas when we get to digestive system. We're not worrying about the exocrine part here, just the endocrine part, meaning the hormones. So look at the pancreas. Two really big hormones here called insulin and glucagon. Now many chemicals affect your blood sugar levels, good old glucose, but these are the two biggest ones by far. Now look at what insulin does right here. Targets most cells of the body and tells them when to take in glucose, and don't forget amino acids too. So let's say you just eaten a big meal. Well, if you just ate a big meal, your blood sugar levels will rise. That's a good time to tell your cells to take in glucose. So when your blood sugar is high, that's when insulin levels are high. That's when it'll be elevated. Insulin's going to target almost everything in your body and tell them to take in glucose, and then again amino acids too. So you'll always hear how insulin's used to lower your blood sugar levels. No. Now, will it lower your blood sugar? Absolutely it does, but that's not its function in the body. Insulin's function is to tell your cells when to take in glucose and then amino acids too. When they take in glucose, yes, that does lower your blood sugar levels, but do not ever say that the function of insulin is to lower your blood sugar. No, it does it, but its function is to tell your cells when to take glucose in. Don't forget those things right there. Now, glucagon kind of has an opposite effect. This one's function is to raise your blood sugar. So let's say you've gone throughout the day, you hadn't eaten anything, and you've been busy. Your blood sugar levels have dropped. Now glucagon will be released. Remember, insulin was released when blood sugar is high. This one's released when blood sugar is low. Glucagon doesn't target everything in your body. It targets your liver and your fat cells. Reason being, that's where almost all stored energy is at in your body. So your blood sugar's low, release glucagon. Tells your liver and fat cells, hey, release stored energy that raises your blood sugar levels up. So that one's function is to elevate your blood sugar levels. And then, of course, with the testes, there's testosterone, another big chemical that's needed for growth. If you want anybody to grow and develop properly, they better have enough growth hormone, better have enough thyroid hormone, and better have enough testosterone or estrogen, depending on the gender. And, of course, there's other things that influence, like insulin definitely does, and so on down the line. But your really big growth-needed hormones or growth hormone, thyroid hormone, and then testosterone and estrogen. But going back to the testes, we got testosterone right here. Of course, the testes are the production site, and this is another chemical that targets most everything in the body. If a male's going to grow and develop properly, they're going to need testosterone. Also needed for the male reproductive system to grow and develop. Also needed for continuing maintenance and function of the male reproductive system. In other words, if it's going to continue to work properly, this chemical is needed. And then with the ovaries, there's estrogen and progesterone. And again, these have similar effects in females like the testosterone does in males. Needed for normal growth and development of a female, needed for development of the female reproductive system, and of course for female reproductive cycles. There's many hormones involved with menses and menstrual cycles. We'll see those further along, but estrogen and progesterone are just a couple of them right there. So here's some other little questions, be good to know. Listing organs of the endocrine system, top to bottom, spirit inferior. Nice little easy question to start with. How are the two halves of that pituitary gland different? Think about that. How are those two halves of that adrenal gland different? Right there. Should say two adrenal glands. What's the difference between an endocrine and exocrine gland? What hormone is responsible for increasing metabolism? Several do, but remember there's something more particular that does that right there. What are a few synonyms for hormones? In other words, chemicals that are similar. Describe the location of each endocrine gland. But remember with each one, primarily what you want to know: where is it made, where does it work, what does it do? Production site, target tissue, and effects. That's the three big things with hormones. So there's just a little quick flyby of the major hormones of the body. We will look at all these a whole lot more in the future.